Hello, my name is Chris Snipes, and you are listening to The Melt. There are areas on this planet that have been called thin places. Places where there seems to be some disintegration between the dimensions that are normally separated by either the lack of sensitivity to their existence or by demarcated boundaries that are there to make it difficult for entities that vibrate at different frequencies to cross. Of course, there are always exceptions to any rule. Therefore, there are beings from beyond the veil that we can perceive under specific circumstances, often unbeknownst to us, or as the case is with the Hudson Valley, which is located on the eastern edge of New York State, in specific places. There exists in the Hudson Valley areas where several different types of paranormal phenomena not only repeatedly occur within the same vicinity, but often at similar times, if not simultaneously. If just one of these encounters wasn't unnerving in and of itself, they prove to be much more so when combined with other seemingly unrelated encounters that end up being undeniably intertwined with each other. Today's guest, paranormal investigator and author of a new book entitled Mysterious Beauty: Living with the Paranormal in the Hudson Valley, Dr. C.S. Matthews tells us about the paranormal history of the Hudson Valley and of the experiences that her and many others have had in the area. I start off the conversation by asking where her interest in these sorts of experiences came from.
I had early experiences, not only myself, but other members of my family. I grew up in a household where my father was a deep believer in ghosts and the other world, the spiritual world, because he was very religious and still is in a certain particular way. He had a kind of a particular interpretation that he gave to this to the spirit world, but he had ghost experiences from the time since he was very young, and talked about those a lot. And he also had UFO experiences, which I didn't know about until much later. But so I kind of grew up in a household where it was understood that that the world that we see is not necessarily the world the way the world really is.
Yeah, sure,
okay, I'll put it that way.
Uh-huh.
But then I also had some of my own experiences, and I did, even though I was raised that way, it sounds, when I talk about it now, it sounds maybe kind of magical or fantastical, but in fact it was really kind of scary, because from my father's perspective, the fact that there was this other realm meant that there were always beings like demons that were going to try to get you. Sure. And so I was raised to fear that other world in a lot of ways. And when I was 6, I had a very profound UFO experience where me and a friend who was older than I had a fairly close visual encounter with something unknown. And it was very scary. And at the time, I had no frame of reference for it.
Sure.
Because it seemed like a physical and not a spiritual thing, But it had a very spiritual impact on me even then. And I wouldn't say that made me fascinated with it. It scared me, and I kept that memory with myself. And didn't really know that other people had these experiences until several years, I won't say many years later, but several years later, I found out that one of my cousins on my father's side was having a series of his own experiences in Iowa, in a different state. I had my sighting in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and so it was in the South. But my cousin was having a series of rather frightening experiences in Iowa. And in fact, at the time, he even claimed that he had some kind of an encounter with a being,
like physical
some kind of interaction. And I don't recall the details of it now because so long ago, but it was really scary to him. And in fact, I think that I think that ultimately it changed the trajectory of his life, even though we have never talked about it. We're like barely in contact now, so it's like he clearly doesn't want to go there.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it was really when I found out that he had these experiences, and it was about that time also. It was in the early 70s. I do remember this because I do remember very clearly the night that Walter Cronkite announced on the television that Project Blue Book had closed, because I watched the news every night. And when he broadcast that, I believe, if I remember this right, maybe it was just in my head, but I think that they actually showed a couple of photos of UFOs, or supposed UFOs during, when Walter Cronkite was talking about it. And all I remember is that I thought to myself, oh, other people have these experiences. It isn't just me. Oh, and I would say that was kind of when my interest got piqued, because it was like he was saying, the Air Force has concluded that there is nothing to this. And I'm like, well, then what did I see? I mean, anyway, so, I started reading, and then in the 70s, there were several other things that happened. Like it was like maybe in 73 or 74. I don't remember the exact date. I encountered the remains of a mutilated cow. I mean, I don't know if you were around in eastern Kansas in the early to mid 70s, but there were a series of cattle mutilations that happened all through eastern Kansas here.
I was in Missouri, so I was just neighbors to all that.
And this was before, Linda Moulton Howe really, kind of put that sort of study or phenomenon on the map. But one of the mutilations occurred very close to where I lived. I mean, it was within bicycling distance,
Wow.
me getting on my bike. And I snuck onto the farm. I was like 13 years old, and I snuck onto the farm, and I didn't know what I would find, but I happened to find the carcass. And this was before there was really a kind of understanding about, like how these might be connected to UFOs. Because at that time they were just saying, oh, that cultists or Satanists or weird people were doing it. That was like the most common explanation.
Sure.
And I had grown up much of my early life on a farm, just in Jefferson County, just up here, not too far from where we are now. And I was very familiar with the way in which, cows died and what carcasses looked like. And this was not like anything I'd ever seen. It was completely bizarre.
Did you know what you were looking for, or did you just stumble
No,
upon it?
no.
Okay.
I mean, I knew that the cow had been mutilated, whatever that meant.
So you knew that happened when you went there?
Yeah, I knew
Okay.
that cow was there,
Gotcha.
and I knew that something weird was with it, but I didn't know like what I was supposed to be seeing.
Gotcha.
And the thing that struck me as odd about it was that there was no decay. The cow had been there for several days in warm Kansas weather. You know how that can be. There was no decay. There was no sign of any carrion eaters, and there were no flies. And that was bizarre. And the cow looked like it had just been dropped from the sky. It was all splayed out really weird, and its tongue was missing. It was like its mouth was open. You could tell its tongue was missing, and there were these like cookie cutter things that were cored out of it. It was you just get a sense that you're seeing something you've never seen before.
Sure.
And you're just like, this is not. There's something weird about this, and so it was much later than, of course, when Linda Moulton Howe kind of made it known that, this was something that was connected to UFOs, and that I was like, oh yeah, I saw one of those. That is, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
So it was just sort of an accumulation of things over time, knowing people whose houses were haunted, having some of my own ghost experiences. I haven't had as many experiences as some people, but I've had varied experiences. And so over time, I just became interested, and more and more interested. And I ended up at KU and being able to do both my master's and my PhD on various topics having to do with UFOs.
Oh, cool.
From an academic perspective. And as a result of that, I figured out different ways of looking at certain components of the phenomena. I noticed certain things about the phenomena, like it's not just that things happen, it's also that we tell stories about what happens. And the stories that we tell about what happens or what we experience are not, they're not objective stories. It's like you can have an objective experience, but if 3 different people have that experience together, they're going to tell slightly different stories about it. It's going to affect them in different ways. And in my dissertation, the example that I use is a famous example. It's the example of Betty and Barney Hill, who, of course, are known for this abduction experience that they had in 1961, which is the year of my birth. It happened almost a little over a month after when I was born, which I think is always thought was fascinating.
Yes.
Just for me, that's just my personal interest. But what's interesting is if you carefully look at the transcript of their hypnotic sessions, and there are ways in which the commonly available through John Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey, doesn't give you the full transcript. You can actually, there's another edition of this book in which fuller transcripts are given. But if you actually read them carefully, put Betty's account and Barney's account side by side. And of course, I'm sure your listeners and that Betty was a white woman and Barney was a black man, at a time when that was not common, in American culture. They actually tell very different stories. And their stories are, especially if you know their backgrounds, their stories are very much colored by their experiences as white and black people, and a white person and a black person. And I know people don't think that's important, but it is.
Sure.
Because different people having experiences and talking about it from their different places gives you different pieces of information about what they're noticing about the experience, and what they're paying attention to. And so you get these different details. And that was what I was mostly interested in my dissertation, was looking at some of the unconscious racial components and ethnic components that occur not in necessarily even individual accounts, but once these accounts become larger social narratives, and then which accounts by virtue of that get published and which don't. And I don't know if it's really a lot different now than it used to be. I've heard that it isn't that much different, that if you look at the popular literature of like UFOs or cryptids even, the popular literature, you'll find there's almost no black people in it, which is important because the literature claims to be universal, and there are in fact traditions of abduction and alien encounter and cryptid encounter in the black community, in the African American community, in the Latino community, and in the Native community, which are quite distinct from the common narrative that we that is mainstreamed and that you find on X-Files and all these other shows.
Sure.
And that's part of what brought me to some of the components of the book that I wrote, Mysterious Beauty, because that informs some of the stories that I tell, and it also informs why I begin with native materials.
Well, it's interesting too, and I never really thought about it until just now, but all of these, or a lot of these non-white traditions and lineages, they dealt with that stuff.
Absolutely.
We're divorced from it. We're an arm's length. That makes us uncomfortable these days. Somehow we've broken off our connection to it, but there's a connection from long ago that those people have with those things, those kinds of experiences. And you mention it in your book too. There's a lot of Native Americans who have tales that are interwoven with the Hudson Valley. And
right, exactly. Well, I think what really clued me into this was when I first talked, not just to natives, but when in the dissertation I was working with African American abductees and contactees. And one of the things that I realized was not only is there sort of this subterranean tradition of abductees and alienness and contact in the African American community that even the African American community is unaware of in many ways, but that the principal difference, and this is connecting to what you're saying, the principal difference was that those individuals had no difficulty talking about the dreamlike quality of their experiences. They didn't draw the distinctions that we tend to in the white paranormal community between hauntings and UFOs, and they just didn't draw those distinctions, and it didn't bother them. Mm-hmm. That was the thing. It was like, I don't know whether that came from the different spiritual traditions that are part of the African American community or whatever. In the dissertation, I allowed them to actually, my witnesses, to actually sort of elaborate on that. And I do a little bit too, but I just found that really striking, because one of the things that you have in the white community or the mainstream community is this insistence that, especially, for example, among UFO people, contactees, you'll have people say, "Oh, I never had any interest. I never had any interest in Star Trek or science fiction," or they want to make sure that you know that they weren't interested in any of that stuff, so they couldn't be making this up, and I always thought that was just really weird, because it was like, just because I've met many abductees who've said that, white abductees who've said that, and then it's kind of like they're not that interested in Star Trek now either. It's just that it's just they had these weird experiences. But in the native communities, they also didn't draw these distinctions, and I talk about this in the book, that I would be like, I talked to one of my native teachers and informants, Evan Pritchard, and I asked him at one point, I said, well, I've talked to a number of witnesses here in Woodstock. This is Woodstock, New York, and they talk about these orange lights that come off of Overlook Mountain. And have you heard anything like that in the tradition? He's like, "Oh, those are the spirit lights," And then he said, "Those are the spirit lights. We sometimes call them the spirit ships, but but there was just no distinction there. It's like, they were the lights that carry the spirits, and that they've always been there. And of course, when we see them, we say, oh, they're UFOs, but they have very ghost-like qualities. They sort of appear and disappear, and if you see one and you approach it, it'll disappear and then reappear over here, But natives just didn't make those distinctions either.
Well, I think, at least modern white culture tends to be very, Western culture really, but tends to be very materialistic. So a lot of people see UFOs as sort of nuts and bolts kinds of things.
Right,
so
right.
To talk of something as ethereal, as interdimensional things that come and go, and that's just too airy-fairy for some people. They want something that concrete.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I guess that's what's interesting to me about UFOs or the paranormal. There are some people that don't like me, that haven't liked that I've classed UFOs with the paranormal, because they want, to them, the paranormal implies something that's not objective, it's not physical. Whereas for them, like you say, they want UFOs to be very physical. And to me, it's like, well, but that's not where the data leads. Where the data leads is that you have things that are physical sometimes and not physical at other times. Or they have both physical and non-physical qualities, just like humans do. Like, we have physical and non-physical qualities. So I'm not sure what the problem is. It's like, I'm sitting here, but I also have emotions and I have love and things like, so prove that. I mean, it's like everything, to me, everything is like that.
Absolutely.
Why weird stuff wouldn't be like that doesn't make any sense to me. But I guess what finally, brought me to the place of writing this particular book is that I other than the fact that there is so much going on in the Hudson Valley, is that it's in this one place, this one, area, this one region of the country where you find all these things together. And not only that, you find them all together in a really deep set of layers. You know what I mean? It's not just stuff that's happening now. It's stuff that was happening in the 19th century. It's stuff that was happening to the early colonists. It's stuff that was happening to the natives. It's been happening there for as long as people have been there to observe it.
Did you move there for that reason?
No.
Okay.
Although I think that
on some level,
maybe on some level, but not consciously.
Sure.
I mean, I talk about this in the book. The Hudson Valley had always fascinated me, and I had always sort of decided that I'd always thought that would be a place I would like to be or like to go. And so when I finally had the opportunity, I took it. And I didn't know that it would lead to this book. I mean, I didn't know that, because at the time when I moved, I had finished my dissertation. I was kind of sick of the paranormal community because it can be so petty and so competitive and just, and it didn't help me in the academic world, I can tell you that. So I had sort of walked away from it. I'd done the dissertation, I was sort of done with it, and I just sort of walked away from it. And so at the time when I first moved there, I wasn't really concerned that much with it anymore. I was doing other things. And then just various series of events just led me right back into it. And I was just like, okay, here I go, there we are, And there were several discrete events, which I do mention briefly in the book without dwelling on my own experience too much. And one had to do with this apparent, I was not there for very long, and I had this apparent sort of haunting experience with what appeared to be the ghost of a deer, which sounds really weird, but that's I can't think of anything else that it would have been. But what really propelled me was when I had the experience, the classic Bigfoot crossing the road experience. And that was like, I didn't even know that Bigfoot were in the Hudson Valley. I had I had never really studied Bigfoot. I didn't know that much about them. I thought, well, sure, there might be some large creature somewhere or wherever, but I didn't think it was in the Hudson Valley. And then this happened, and I just thought, oh my God, what did I see? I mean, when it happened, I just like slammed the brakes on my car, and I just stood there in my car in the middle of the road, in the middle of nowhere, in the pitch black, dark night. And I'm just like, oh my God, what did I see? It was very strange. It was just a classic, you turn a corner and there's this large thing crossing the road right in your headlights.
Did it look at you?
Well, I had startled it, so it held its arm up like this to shield its eyes. It just kept going. It kind of sped up, but it was going across the road, and there was a sign there, a road sign there. I was later able to go back and sort of calculate its height, and it had to have been at least 8 or 9 foot tall. It was huge, covered with hair. I saw it very clearly. The hair, it was sort of a reddish brown hair. And it was striding, it wasn't a bear, couldn't have been a bear. I don't know what a 9-foot guy in a suit would have been doing out there in the middle of the night. I was driving home from I'd taught a class. And so my brain was thinking about the class, and I was paying attention. I had been on that road before, and I knew that deer ran across that road all the time. And so that's a problem here. It's a big problem in New York. So I was watching for deer. And so I was just paying attention as I was turning So that's what I was expecting to see. And then I saw that. And so I Googled and found out that, lo and behold, Bigfoot are seen there. And that's where I came in contact with Gail Beatty, who's one of the first people that I interview in the book.
Oh, and I definitely want to get to her story. Holy moly.
Yeah, yeah. So she's like one of the first, and from her, it all started. And then what ended up happening is I became the paranormal reporter for what was then Examiner, the online newspaper, which became Axios a few years ago. And of course they don't do paranormal stuff anymore, but I wrote for them for about 4 years, reporting on paranormal stuff in the Hudson Valley and other things. And at one point, I did a report on Gail, and her, basically what the story that I wrote helped put her on the map, which I didn't find out until later. But after I wrote that story and published it, she started getting calls from everywhere. And that was through that, then I started connecting with other people. I also did an interview of Linda Zimmerman, who I also feature in the book. And then that's when I started meeting some of the other people. So that started, and that was like in 2011 or something. So by that time, then I was all in it again.
It sucked you back
in. It sucked me right back in. So
why do you think that there is such a long history of paranormal stuff going on in the Hudson Valley?
Well, we can only speculate. I mean, I speculate a little bit in the book. It's got a unique geology. It's got the kind of geology that has been identified by some researchers as possibly being connected to the ability of reality to manifest certain things. And this includes an abundance of certain types of minerals, which generally leads to geomagnetic abnormalities or anomalies. They're not abnormalities, they're anomalies. And then lots of water. Water seems to be a really important component. If you go to places like Skinwalker Ranch even, and you look at the geomagnetic surveys, you'll find that there's lots of subterranean water. Even in the places where it's like desert, there's a lot of other mineral stuff and things going on in those places. And so there are scientists that speculate, that are interested in this, that speculate that something about all of that combo creates the conditions that make it possible for certain things to manifest, like maybe other worlds to manifest, portals or whatever you want to call them. I mean, we use these words, we don't know what the hell we're talking about, but, in other words, that make it possible for us, if you believe in the many worlds theory, that make it possible for different worlds to meet and collide and sometimes overlap.
Yeah, because I mean, there's a lot there. Like, as you said, there's a lot of different phenomena happening there.
Right. And then it's got a very deep history, in the sense that it's got a very fraught history. It's a history that it also seems to be the case that, especially if we're talking about like haunted areas, and people who know about ghosts know this, that if you have places where there's been lots of grief or emotion or violence, anything that's been emotionally intense, that somehow that also seems to fire up the energy in some way. I don't know how to sound that without it sounding too new age, but it's like there's something about human memory in these places as well. If you believe that humans, that humans are a contributing factor to some of what, and I'm not justifying a simple imagination, whatever that is, but in the sense that we all have heard about that places are haunted because lots of things have happened there, and I think that's certainly lots of things have happened there. If you go back to American history, the Hudson Valley area was one of the places where Europeans and natives first fought really awful battles, for possession of the land. It was one of the places where the Revolutionary War was fought, and so it's got just a lot of people have invested a lot of stuff there, a lot of their time and energy and dreams, and so it's a very, what I tell people is you need to go to the Hudson Valley and you need to stay there for a little while, and you'll see what I mean, because it's just thick there. It's like, native stuff is all around you. It's in place names and street names, the very shape of the roads. All the roads are built on old trails, so it makes them really windy and weird and kind of odd and organic. It's if you go to that part of the country, it's impossible to explain how to get somewhere, because if you're from Kansas, everything's on a grid.
Yes.
Right. There are no grids. Now you go to Manhattan, there's a little bit, like right on the island.
Yeah.
But up, it's like, forget it. It's very, and you just have to, you get used to it. I mean, I've lived in Kingston now, or right outside of Kingston now for 6 years now, and I'm only just figuring out how to get to certain parts of Kingston, and the entire city is only like 5 or 6 miles wide. It's just full of windy things, and that's just because of the organic way in which all that stuff was sort of put down. It's just it's very different from here. I can tell you that. So I mean, I don't know if any of those will answer the question of why. But I think that all of those things have to be, if we ever come up with a why, all of those things have to be there, if that makes sense.
Sure, absolutely. And because there's such a long history, it seems like, from what you described in the book, those kinds of experiences are sort of woven into the fabric of day-to-day existence, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people. Well, just even the gym that I talk about, that I work out at,
the haunted gym,
and we've had people come downstairs, people who've gone upstairs to work out. Most of the hauntings are upstairs, and they come down the stairs and they're like, I just had this really. Is there something going on upstairs? And be in Austin will just go, yeah, well, and it turns, and of course, like, what he found out is, once these things started happening, then he started talking to the landlord and to the other people who are tenants in the building, and they'd all had these experiences, and these experiences have been going on for decades, so it's like people just become accustomed to it. And when you're around people who are just accustomed to it, then you become accustomed to it. Sure. It's still kind of, I will tell you, it still kind of creeps me out a little bit. I mean, the last time something happened to me up at the gym, I was upstairs. I'd gone upstairs to warm up for a boxing session. I was up there by myself, and all of a sudden, the speakers to the stereo that were turned off, like everything was turned off, the speakers, just these two voices came through the speakers, and there was no way for anything to come through them. There was nothing was on, you know what I mean? It couldn't be like a radio or anything like that. And I couldn't understand exactly what they were saying, but what was weird about it, it was like a female voice in the background and then a male voice. But what was weird was that I had just had the thought. I had just thought to myself, I wonder if anything has happened here lately. And then that voice, it was like about 30 seconds later, and it sounded sort of like it said, I see, or something like that, but I don't know for sure. And I just looked at it and I was like, okay, I'm going to go downstairs now and wait for my trainer. It's really weird when you have these experiences. You think that it'd be really cool, but but when you really do have them, you just there's a part there's a part of me that feels like I've stumbled onto something I shouldn't really know very much about, and so I still get kind of creeped out.
Sure. I suppose that's healthy.
I suppose, I mean, it's not like the shows on the paranormal shows,
God,
where they're oh, they've got all the equipment up and they're yelling at the ghosts or whatever. That's I haven't found that works very well.
Exactly. I wouldn't want to come out in circumstances like that.
No,
I'm not communicate to these idiots.
It's like these people are stupid, So, but for me, it still sort of creeps me out. So it's like when I go when the few times that I've gone with Gail on field research, she does two types of field research. The first type is kind of a general survey, and she'll take a larger team out then, and they just sort of, what they all do is they sort of split up, and I've gone out with her in those situations, and we split up and we just see if we find different things, and then we report back, and some of us will take electromagnetic stuff and whatever, and then once she kind of gets a survey of it, then she'll go out with just one other person, and then they'll just do more private interviews and get more of a personal sense of what's going on there. I haven't been with her on the more personal things because she likes to do that herself. If it turns out that they have like that the person has also had any kind of UFO experience or ghost experience, then she will kind of consult with me about it, because both of those things really freak her out. She can do with cryptids, but not UFOs.
Wow.
She just they freak her right out.
And again, we'll get to it. The episode that you wrote about in the book, her experience.
Which
that
one?
Would creep me out. Well, let's just. I keep dancing around it.
Yeah.
The one that happened on December 30th, I believe, 2013. Her encounter in the forest.
Yeah. Oh, you mean with the light that went up?
Yeah. That's how it ended, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that's what changed her about this, because up to that point, she had just thought that she was just dealing with some kind of an unknown primate, and that was it. And I can remember that because I had my experience with the whatever walking across the road prior to her experience there. So I had already contacted her and talked to her, and we'd had sort of a conversation about, because I just wanted to kind of know where she stood about Bigfoot, because I didn't know her, I just met her. And she was at that time just really, as you say, nuts and bolts, She said, I don't want to talk about any of that weird stuff because I'm a good Catholic and I'm just not going to talk about that. And she just was not interested at all. And then she had this experience where, she had been working with this guy at this habituation site where they had lots of different kinds of experiences, which I describe in the book. Very odd experiences. They're the kinds of things that you hear more about in like fairy lore in Ireland, some of them. And then they had that experience where they go and they actually, there's, encounter across a creek at least 5 individuals. They were able to get infrared FLIR imaging on 5 distinct individuals, which I've seen that film, but because it's associated with this homeowner, he won't let it become public because he doesn't want it to affect his ability to sell the house. So he has not let her make it public, but I have seen it. And it's very clear that there are 5 heat signatures there, and they are just destroying that part of the woods. I mean, ripping up huge trees. I mean, I do include a photo of some of the damage that they found that was there the next day. But then, and they were obviously being hit with certain types, the males in particular that were with her were being hit, they seemed to be being hit by what felt to them like infrasound or something. In other words, they would like, and this happened first to the guy who got the FLIR. You know, he got the images and he said that he had the images, and then all of a sudden he said it felt like he was hit with like almost a bolt of electricity that went through his body, and he almost passed out. Wow. And it took him hours to recover from that. He was like, once they got back inside, he was like retching, and he was just really ill from it. And they were having electromagnetic problems with the devices. And then everything culminated at the very end. There was lots of noise between everything being broken, and there were like these vocalizations coming from the woods, screams and growls and roars, and then all of a sudden, this blue light just shot up straight up into the sky, and everything stopped, just like that. And that she said that freaked her out more than anything else that she had ever experienced. And they all went back inside, and she said that it took her, it was kind of like a revelation. She just like, I don't have any idea what I'm feeling. Yeah. And Bruce had a similar experience. I talk about Bruce, how he had been dealing with this Kinderhook creature around his grandmother's house for months, and like years, in fact. And then he finally decided that he said he just had this impulse to go out and sort of confront whatever it was. And so he had driven to this one spot where they had found footprints. He hadn't actually seen anything there, but he had found footprints. And he didn't know whether he would hear or see anything. He had no idea. He didn't even know why he was there exactly. It was just because he just wanted, he was thought something might happen. So he was about ready to leave. He sat there for a long time in his car. He was about ready to leave. And then all of a sudden, he started hearing these noises from the woods. And they sounded very much like the Ron Moorhead chattering, if you've heard those recordings. In fact, when he heard those recordings, he was like, oh yeah, that's pretty much what they sounded like. There were like 2 or 3 individuals seeming to have this animated conversation that was quite loud and not that far from him, only about maybe 100 yards from him. And as he puts it, he said, I kept trying to make myself get out of the car, but my legs wouldn't move. He just couldn't make himself get out of the car. And finally, he managed to sort of get out of the car and step out of the car. And as soon as he did that, he saw this light just sort of go up, this white light sort of go up like a bubble of light, and then just sort of wink out, and everything fell silent. And he said, because he grew up in a haunted house, and there were lots of poltergeist activities all the time. In fact, I talk about some of the strange things that happened to him and his grandmother. And he said that of all the things that happened, that experience freaked him out the most, because he realized that he had absolutely no idea what we were dealing with. That there are things in the world and in the universe that we do not know about, and that we cannot control, and that have nothing to do with us whatsoever. And now when he thinks about it, and I think Gail's kind of getting to this point now, it's scary, but it's also really amazing. And it's also really, to me, it's like really proof that there's so much more to know, and there's so much more to the universe. And so it's scary because we have, our real ego attachments to whatever we think it might be. And there's kind of a fear we don't want to get hurt or damaged or anything too. But to me, it's just, it's really an opportunity for wonder and exploration, And that's the way natives approached it. Now, you know, I'm not saying that things never happened to them in their traditions that scared them. In fact, there are places in the Hudson Valley, and I talk about these like Bannerman Island. There are places where natives tell you not to go, or places where you should not go. And in fact, the woods, the forests of the Hudson Valley, I've been told many times by natives, do not go into them by yourself at night. It's better that you don't go in there by yourself at all, but especially at night. And it's partly because there are wild animals there, but that's not what they're referring to. They're referring to the little people. They're referring to other beings, and you know, the natives had their own ways of dealing with this, but they also took certain types of care that you know, white people just don't know about. And I've, you know, I encountered some stories, which I include in the book, about people who had odd experiences in the woods. And I did have one really odd experience once in the woods that that I don't know what it was, but it involved some missing time, and it was pretty scary. And because I don't know what it was exactly, I don't really talk about it very much, but it was odd. And I think that the only thing that kept maybe something worse or odder from happening was that I remembered something that I was told by one of my native teachers to do, and I did it. And it didn't stop what was going on, but it seemed to change the nature of what it was a little bit. But that's part of the reason why, before you go into the woods to hunt or to even walk, like Gail does this now, before she goes into the woods, before she even starts the surveys. In fact, that's part of the reason why she takes me along on occasion, is because I've been taught how to do this. You give offerings to the forest's edge, and to let everybody know that you're coming into somebody else's house, essentially. And she, according to her, that's changed her whole experience of it all. And she doesn't even hunt anymore. You know, it's completely changed how she kind of operates. I mean, they take some guns for protection, but they don't carry them openly, you know, and because you will occasionally encounter bears and stuff up there. But I mean, I live in a place where occasionally bears will come through my back door, my backyard, you know. So you do have to be careful. But sure. You know, that when natives warn you about stuff, they're not talking about bears. So.
Yeah. They're used to bears. So do you think maybe possibly what the mind-blowing aspect of both of those experiences were for those people was the combination of what could be deemed as a cryptid and some sort of...
I think so.
Yeah.
I think that the fact that you can't, you know, when you have something like that happen, you can't just say, well, it's not just a physical being. There's something else going on there, and there's some other quality to this experience. I mean, it's also physical, but it's also not physical. You know.
And you talk about that a lot in the book, how there's these seemingly different categories of paranormal experiences often overlap or will happen in the same places or at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And that's that's part of the reason why I think that the Hudson Valley is unique in this way. It's not the only unique place like that, but it's one unique place because you get all of these things together. You find that there are multiple locations where you'll get cryptids, hauntings, and UFOs, for example, like Pine Bush, where all that stuff is happening, not all the time, but it's all happening close enough together in the same vicinities that you cannot conclude that on some level these are different categories of experience. They're all part of the Pine Bush experience. You know, most people think of Pine Bush as just a place where UFOs happen. it's like, yeah, but you got to, first of all, you got to see what we're talking about when we mean UFOs, because most of the lights and stuff that are seen in Pine Bush actually happen at about ground level to about maybe 4 foot up. They're not way up in the sky. They're more like the kinds of things that you would hear in like fairy lore.
Yeah, like will-o'-the-wisps.
Exactly. But they're clearly intelligent. They follow people around. They expand and contract. They are connected with other kinds of experiences, like the shadow animal experiences that I talk about. They're connected with really weird hauntings. They're connected with time distortions and other things that people have experienced like that. So it's not, it's like, then you also have, the large classic triangular UFOs and all that kind of stuff. Then you have the weird light strobes, the pulsing lights that come from the ground and go up, or sometimes from the sky and come down. It's, I mean, when I first started putting together the material for Pine Bush, I think the Pine Bush chapter was probably one of the hardest chapters, because when I first started putting that chapter together, I was really unaware of the complexity of the various phenomena and how this all comprised the Pine Bush phenomena. Because I thought it was just like maybe one or two things too. And then I started talking to the witnesses, and I started doing and I was like, this is like one of the strangest places I've ever heard about in my entire life, and the fact is that people that live there are just used to it. Almost everybody there knows somebody who's had an experience, or they themselves have had an experience. And I don't know of very many places like that.
Absolutely. Well, there is a lot of talk of triangular crafts in the sky, but are they mostly sightings of the crafts, or are there abductions or experiences?
There are people who report abductions and contacts. And there are some of those in various parts of the valley. Like, probably Whitley Strieber is probably the most famous of all of those types of things. His initial visitor experience, as he describes it, occurs actually in the larger Pine Bush area, which is not just Pine Bush, which is a hamlet in a township, but it's actually an entire area. When someone says the Pine Bush phenomena, they're referring to a much larger region, of which Pine Bush is kind of the center. Whitley's experiences happened within that area. But there are other people in Socrates. The people that either that I interviewed or that Linda Zimmerman interviewed that I then reported on. There are numerous people who reported contacts and abductions from the time period of the night siege UFOs in the mid to late 1980s. But there are people who still have those experiences now. I talk about them a little bit, but I don't focus on them so much in the book, simply because those accounts tend to be really sensationalized, and sometimes if you focus too much on them, then you kind of miss the larger context out of which those reports are coming. Because even though you have those reports, they're not the majority of reports.
Sure. Well, okay. Can you go into a little more about the night siege UFO
Oh yeah.
flap?
Well, and this is probably the most famous of the Hudson Valley sort of paranormal events that people do know about. But it was a series of sightings that occurred from roughly about 1984 is when they began. Even though there had been things like this seen previously, we're just talking in large numbers. From about 1984 to about 1987, even though on either side of that, like I said, people are seeing things, but that's sort of like when the bulk of it occurred. There were sightings of several different types of UFOs or aerial things. What are they called? Unidentified UAPs. That's the term that is used.
The newest term,
UAPs. um, and they were seen. What was significant about them is that they were seen in highly populated areas. Mm-hmm. So they were mostly seen in what's called the Lower Hudson, which is Southern Dutchess and Orange County, going all the way down to Rockland County, which is where New York City is, and then east into Connecticut, and then west into parts of New Jersey. So it was sort of the metro area, if you will, the greater metro area of New York City. And a lot of these UFOs, these large triangular UFOs, were seen on major thoroughfares like the Taconic Parkway, which is a principal commuting artery for people that are coming out of New York City and live in places like Putnam County and Westchester County and maybe Southern Dutchess County. And then also 84, which is another principal suburban interstate, commute interstate. So these places, these arteries are going to always have lots and lots of people on them. And so there were times when there were times when 500 cars would be pulled off of Taconic Parkway watching one of these slow-moving triangular objects moving across, on its way to Danbury, Connecticut, or wherever. And what's important is that there were three main kinds of ships that were seen, or things that were seen. There were the large triangular objects where you have the lights at each corner of the triangle, and then sometimes in the middle as well. And then you also had circular arrangements of lights that were seen, kind of looking reminiscent of the Phoenix lights, sort of, more or less. And in addition to the triangular shape, you also had sort of a V shape, or what was called the boomerang. In fact, it was called the Westchester Wing at one point. It was coined by the local media. And then there were also these just single. They were either usually be single lights or dual lights that would be seen. And those were often more startling to people because those would often follow people home. They would they seemed to be more interactive with people. So those lights would usually be either yellow or kind of orangish, or maybe a little kind of white orange or something. So there were these three distinct kinds of lights that people saw. And what made this time period unique is that not only did you have all these witnesses that would see them, but there is some photographic and film evidence of it as well. And some of these things would appear over there were two instances of large triangles appearing over Indian Point Power Plant, which is a major nuclear facility. There were triangles seen over West Point. There were triangles seen over, I can't remember exactly what city it was, but over what township it was in Putnam County, but it was over a large triangle appeared over the city center while a town board meeting was going on. So all the police were there and they saw it, Wow. And so it was some of the sightings were attributed at the time. Skeptics said, these are just pilots and ultralights, with lights. And there are several problems to that, especially if you think about the 1980s. And the main problem is that ultralights at the time made a lot of noise. And so a lot of times, most of the time, these things were completely silent. And in fact, there were several instances where people would see these strange things, and then maybe 2 nights later, there would be some people up there with ultralights, and observers could easily tell the difference. Sure. There was no problem telling the difference. The other thing is that it was illegal at that time. I don't know how the FAA rules are now, but it was illegal at that time for ultralights to fly at night. So whoever was doing that, if anybody was doing it, was doing it illegally. And so, there were these rumors that there were these guys, coming out of Stewart Air Force Base at the time doing it for a joke. Well, that might be true for some things, but that doesn't explain all the sightings. And it certainly doesn't explain, you know, large silent triangles that would be seen over bodies of water drawing up, you know, water from with that were seen several times. There are just too many weird sightings that were seen by literally hundreds of people at a time. In fact, I think it's estimated that the number of sightings was somewhere, of recorded sightings, is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 people. And I and Linda Zimmerman, every time we give a presentation there, we get new sightings and new reports from people who saw things during that time period who never told anyone, including Gail Beatty. She saw a triangle over Stissing Hill, the same place where she had her initial Bigfoot experience. It was years after that, but she saw it. There was a triangle that appeared over Stissing Mountain, and so it's like there's just too many witnesses. It can't be, you know, it can't be that all the time.
Yeah,
absolutely.
You know,
so people still see these things on occasion. Like at the cover of the book is Ashokan Reservoir. And the reason why I wanted to include Ashokan Reservoir there is that's one of the places where people still see triangle UFOs.
Cool. Auspicious.
Auspicious. Well, as recently as just a year ago. You know, so.
Interesting. Are there rumors or confirmed cases of there being military bases?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, not military bases, but military involvement in some of this stuff.
Because you mentioned, I think it was at the end of or around, sometime shortly after the Gail Beatty experience that you described, that some men in black cars showed up?
Oh, this was this was not at her. This was
Okay.
not at this place. It was at
Gotcha.
a different place. Now she had recently, and this happened just about a year ago. She had gotten a report from a guy in New Jersey who had had a fairly intense cryptid encounter, and it started out in the classic way where he had gone out to put the garbage out. And there was one standing by the garbage can out in the back. It was a kind of a rural cabin, so he had a big, like almost a dumpster style then he could just have someone come in and pick it up, and change it. So he wouldn't have to worry about, having to deal with garbage all the time. And it could also lock up so that bears couldn't get into it. And he just went out there and it was just standing there. And it could, freaked him out because he was a city guy. He had just gotten this cabin, this place in the country, and then after that, I guess a number of different things happened at his house. He something would run past his house and bang on the walls. It's kind of classic not UFO, kind of classic Bigfoot stuff. The cryptid lore.
Sure.
And he found some footprints and stuff like that. And so he made one phone call to her, and Gail has described this to me. He made one phone call to her in which he just barely described it. You know what I mean? He just said, "I've heard that you research this stuff, and I think I've had some experiences out here." And he just gave her like the bare bones, kind of what I've just told you now, not a lot of detail. I think he was calling from work, and that was part of the reason why. And so she said, "Well, I'll come out, I'll come out in the next few days and I'll interview you and kind of look around." And because New Jersey's kind of far for her, but, it's not that far. So she thought she would do it. And then like 2 or 3 days later, he called her back and called it all off. And he told her this whole story about how he had knows it like within a day, the next day after he had talked to her on the phone, like from work, these people showed up at his house. And they claimed that they were from whatever the New Jersey Department of Conservation is, which I can't remember now what the acronym is. But the problem was that they were in unmarked cars. And usually state agencies like that have marked cars. And they were in unmarked vehicles. and they harassed him about it. It was like they were like grilling him about what happened, and he would describe what happened, and they were like, "Oh, that's just a bear. Oh, that's just a bear." And they were telling him, "You just saw a bear." And he found out, he got a phone call from his girlfriend and found out that they had been harassing her at her work, even though he had never actually mentioned any of this happened. She doesn't live there in the cabin. He had never actually told her about what had gone on. And so he was like, how, his response was, how would they even know that this happened unless they already knew?
And then that just blows a lot of questions.
I know, that just makes you kind of, but it scared him enough that he just called it off, because he didn't, because it just freaked him out. And that's happened a few times where she has gotten, somebody has contacted her, and then they've pulled out because they've said that they've had something weird happen to them. I had this happen with a really classic UFO experience what was it? It was December of last year. The same guy who has the gym that's haunted. He has a cousin who apparently had some classic, what are called fireball UFO, classic fireball UFO sighting, and got some film of it, got some footage of it, only about 4 miles from my house. There's a place called Sturgeon Pool, and he happened to be there late at night, and he saw this amazing kind of fireball display in the dead of winter, over, so it can't be insects or anything, over the lake, and but then he started having other kinds of weird experiences, which started freaking him out, and he wanted to talk about what had happened to him, and but it turned out that every time he thought about talking to me or somebody else, stuff would happen around, like poltergeist stuff would happen around the house, and he just concluded that he wasn't going to talk about it because it was just freaking him out too much. And then he started noticing, and this could be just paranoia on his part, I don't know, but he said that he started noticing that it seemed to be like military types just popping up wherever he was, and he started feeling like he was being watched. And I talked to my friend about this, and I said, is he normally very paranoid like this? And he was like, no, he normally doesn't care about this stuff at all. He said, he told me his behavior was very strange. So I don't know what actually happened there, but I did see the footage, and it was very interesting. Something happened to him. He saw something, because he's not the kind of person apparently to lie about that kind of thing.
It's strange because I could see that in accordance with something like a UFO, which could potentially be some secret military thing. But look, with a cryptid sighting, that's
well, yeah, I know,
so
I know. Well, and that's true. But if you've read like John Keel,
sure,
he talks about how you have these, wherever the paranormal stuff pops up, you have these other little weird denizens who will pass themselves off as military or government. Sure. So I don't think they're government at all. I have no idea who they are. If they are government, if they're government, I don't think they're state government. But
they're shadow government.
They're shadow, whatever. But John Keel came to the conclusion that they were. He came to the conclusion that they were not the government either, but that they were some component of the phenomenon itself, whatever that means, that were almost a tricksterish sort of element to it, and he drew comparisons between some of that stuff and some of the stuff that you have. There are similar kinds of characters, confusing characters like that show up in like Irish folklore. Where you just have like what appears to be a normal person. They're called the black man, not like black in a racial sense,
sure,
but
sure.
And it's a person who seems to show up and just sort of throw a monkey wrench into someone's life or into someone's attempt to understand something. And it was, in certain Catholic circles, it was seen as a part of the devil, but he just thinks it's part of whatever it is, whatever the intelligence or intelligences are behind all of that. He thinks that whatever that so-called military thing is, that's simply part of it. It's another manifestation of it. I don't know what I think about that stuff personally. I haven't had, give me some wood here. I haven't had any direct experiences yet with that. I did have, when I was living just north of here in Jefferson County in Perry, and I was doing my research for my master's. I was getting some material in the mail out there. I did have apparently my mail was tampered with, and the only reason I know that is because the mail deliverer, the carrier, caught someone tampering in my mail.
Wow, like in your mailbox?
In my mailbox. She would put the mail in and drive off. And what happened was, and she told me, because what happened is that she had put some stuff in my mailbox and she drove off, and then she stopped because she realized she'd forgotten something. And so without thinking, she just looked in, she was like about half a mile down the road, and she just looked in the rearview mirror and she saw that somebody had pulled up, and it wasn't me, and they were digging through the mailbox. And so she turned right around and came back, and then they drove off really quick. So after that, she one time when I was home, the last summer that I was at that location, it was a very rural area. I was able to actually stay home, and I was preparing for my oral exam, so I was actually able to just stay home and do research. I'd saved up a bunch of money and was able to not have to work. And so I happened to be home, and she came and she drove into the driveway, which was really weird. And she handed me my mail, and I said, okay, and she goes, I'm going to start putting your mail on your back porch. And she explained to me what she had seen. And she said, I have seen some of the materials that you've been getting. Have you talked to the person down the way? And it turned out that my neighbor, who was about literally 3/4 of a mile down the road, knew about odd experiences that occurred, the history of odd experiences that had occurred, that had occurred right in the area where I lived.
Oh, wow.
So I was able to talk to her a little about some of it. But we got our mail differently as a result of that. And there were at least 2 instances where large unmarked helicopters went over our house at that time.
And this was when you were working?
I was working on my master's.
What exactly did it have to do with?
It had to do with looking at abduction narratives, and I was mostly looking at the way in which the contact abduction experience changes how people see the world, and how people talk about those changes. So that I was in a religious studies program at KU, and so I was interested in experiences of prophecy and revelation and conversion, and so I was comparing what I called the transformative effect of these experiences to those other experiences. Not saying they were exactly the same, but talking about how they had some of the same components, and also talking about the way in which people actually construct the narratives of unusual experiences, so that, if you have an unusual experience, it changes you so much so that you actually retroactively look back in your life, and your entire life sort of gets rewritten in the lens of this experience that has happened. But what ends up happening is that then when people talk about their experiences, just like when you asked me the questions at the very beginning, we're expected to go back to the beginning you know, and sort of remember things that way. But in a way, but that's not necessarily how those experiences occur. You know, a lot of abductees and contactees, they will talk about how they seemed, in their own minds, they seem to have been living normal lives, and then boom, this thing happens, right? Whitley Strieber's a great example. Boom, this thing happens. And then they reinterpret everything that's happened in the past in the context of this transformative change. And I wasn't criticizing, it's normal to do that, but that doesn't necessarily tell me what happened, but it tells me how important the thing was that happened. And people who have conversion experiences do the same thing. You know, they will have a conversion or a revelation experience, and then they'll reinterpret their entire past through the lens of this. So that's all I was doing. I was just looking at how whatever the UFO contact abduction experience is, from a narrative perspective, human beings have this tendency to construct their narratives that way. And that alone should tell us that whatever these experiences are, that they are very significant. And that alone should make them merit study, regardless of what people think about the objective nature of the, you know, in terms of whether it's really an alien that's talking to you or whatever. To me, that may, you know, when I was doing during the thesis, that makes no difference. People are responding as if it was real, and it transforms people's lives in the same way, negatively or positively. So it really doesn't make any difference whether there's this objective thing, whatever that means. You know, it affects people as if there was one.
So that research must have put you on somebody's radar.
Put me on somebody's radar.
Interesting. Is that the only time that you've noticed that?
I've had a couple. When I was doing the first part of my dissertation, I did have a couple of other experiences. They're kind of diffuse, though, although that might be because of what I was going through in my life at that time. I was going through a really difficult period in my personal life, and so both of those experiences, I don't know that I was paying quite as much attention to them, you know, in the same way. Now, when I was writing my dissertation, I did have some haunting experiences in the apartment in which I was living, but I think that was largely because a person that was dear to me at the time had just died, and so I think that was more related to that. But there was this weird way in which, when I was actually writing the dissertation, that I had this weird feel. This sounds so strange, but it's the way I feel about it. I had this strange kind of protection around me. That's how I felt. I felt like whatever might oppose me in this just couldn't do it, you know. And you know, maybe it's because I had sort of changed my own spiritual practice or whatever. I mean, you know, there's all kinds of things. I'm not as scared about all that stuff as I used to be. But you know, I'm still cautious about certain things. You know, I wouldn't say that I'm paranoid exactly, but I'm still cautious about some things. There are certainly some things that I don't just talk about real publicly.
Personal experiences.
Personal experiences, and also just sort of, you know, realizations that I think I may have had. I think I may have about sort of the larger way in which our, you know, the institutions that we call the government and all of that, how they may interact with some of this stuff. There's bits and pieces of some information that I've gotten at different times that I don't talk about openly, just simply because, well, you know, at this point in our history, it would only add fodder for someone's conspiracy theory. And the truth is that, for me, is that while there are conspiracies in the world, if you actually look at the course of government involvement in some of this stuff, it's actually been pretty plain.
That they have been involved.
It's actually been pretty plain. I mean, Jacques Vallée, all I have to do is read some Jacques Vallée and you get that.
Sure.
You know, so it's like, it's like, of course they would cover some things up because they cover up stupid stuff, but their involvement is pretty clear. So,
and there seems to be, the public party line is that, we are basically the new religion is scientism. So we're living in supposedly a materialist, reductionist existence, and there's nothing beyond physical matter. And that's kind of, it seems like the party line that we're supposed to be believing in.
The official line of consciousness.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and we all know it's horse crap.
Absolutely. It's the 3D conspiracy.
It's like a blah 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 blah.
It's like if it can't be proven in a laboratory or measured or quantified, then it doesn't exist, or replicated,
Right,
bullshit.
right.
Total
It's like whatever.
Okay, I'm
what time is? Yeah,
we your time.
Yeah,
we're 9:15.
Yeah, we need to.
Okay, can I ask you maybe two more questions?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. With all of your experiences that you've heard from people and your own personal experiences, do you get the feeling that all of these phenomena are sort of transdimensional?
There's a well, I'll put it this way. I think that life is transdimensional. I think our own lives are that way. So it would make perfect sense to me that any of this would be, because it's part of the way it all is. I mean, maybe I'm odd that way, but my own personal, metaphysics, if you want to call it that, is I personally believe in the many worlds theory, that there are probably an infinite number of probable and possible realities that are all around us, that we are moving through, and that all time is simultaneous. And there are various fields of, various studies of quantum physics that speculate about these things. So I think that if that is plausible, then, and that's true for us, as physical as we seem to be, then that would be true for any of this stuff. And it's just that, these, if we're talking about beings, like say cryptids are beings, or some of the little people, which we didn't talk that much about, but we should talk about the little people more.
I did have a little person question.
Okay, why don't you tell? Well, I'll answer this, and
okay.
You can ask me the little person question. But because I think that the little people should be talked about more. I think that they're very important. But so I would say but in the context that everything is, and the reason why these phenomena seem odd to us is because we've come to believe that we just live in this very physical, materialistic universe. I've had the good fortune, the good luck to begin the process of actually studying native languages of some of the people that inhabited, the Hudson Valley, and studying their languages. And their languages are full of what we would call quantum understandings of reality. And, people can live like that and still function just fine, adequately in a physical universe, understanding that this pillow is more than just a pillow. It is also a pillow, but it also has a reality that is not physical to us, that we can't see, because our I wouldn't say that our senses are so limited. Our senses are so focused in a particular way. So I hope that answers your question somewhat.
Absolutely.
But sure, absolutely. It's not even. I mean, we're all transdimensional. So of course, Bigfoot's going to be transdimensional.
I agree. Absolutely.
So ask me the little person question, and then ask me the other one too. So. I'll try to answer them quick.
I have no time limits, but I just want to be sensitive to your time limits. Do you think that the little people that have been encountered in the Hudson Valley have anything in common with European fairy lore?
Well, I think that they are, you know, I think that the stories point to the stories in the Hudson Valley and natives generally. There isn't a native group in North America that doesn't have a story about little people of one type or another. It's ubiquitous. And obviously there are stories of little people in Europe and actually other places, Asia and Africa and everything else.
Sure.
And I think that all of those stories point to the reality that there are beings that coexist with us and have always coexisted with us. That when we experience them as little people. I don't think that they're that little necessarily. It's just that when they appear physically, that's how we see them. Mm-hmm. But absolutely. I mean, when you say the same, it's like, well, I don't know that the she in Ireland are exactly the same as the Wemeticanis in the Hudson Valley, or Pukwudgej in the Hudson Valley. But I think that because just like there are different groups of people, you might have different groups of little people. But I think that these stories point to a common reality of the planet.
Yeah. Fairy circles, crop circles, abductions, fairy abductions.
Yeah, I mean, the story of Rip Van Winkle it has that classic little people component even in it, even though Washington Irving doesn't really call it that. Anybody who would have been reading Rip Van Winkle in the early 19th century would instantly have recognized that he's referencing, when Rip Van Winkle goes on a walk in Tatterskill Falls in the Catskills, and he encounters these little people, and he disappears for 20 years. Anybody would know immediately that it's little people they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that story is that he draws upon both European and native sources to tell that story. Yeah. So
and isn't it that everybody else experienced time in a much different way, that it was just a flash to him? It was just it's that idea that time doesn't move the same way in different places. Mm-hmm. and you have that in native stories of time being lost, and just like you do in European stories or Middle Eastern stories about the jinn. Same thing. Absolutely. In your book, you also include a chapter about Eugenia Macer's story.
Eugenia, yes.
Could you tell the listeners who she is and why she's important, why you included her?
Well, I included her for several reasons. One is that I had the opportunity to get to know her before she died. I was first introduced to her through the writings of a guy named Andy Colvin, who I don't know if you're familiar with, but he has, in the past few years, he has kind of single-handedly published and kept republished most of John Keel's work, because he became friends with John Keel later in Keel's life. And he also became friends with Gray Barker, Gray Barker's widow, and got the rights to a lot of Gray Barker's stuff as well. Excuse me. So he's published a lot of stuff that has been out of print or hasn't been reprinted for a long time. But he wrote his own series of books called The Moth. He's all into Mothman. That's his cryptid of choice. and he wrote a trilogy called The Mothman's Photographer, which is a series of interviews and reflections that he did about Mothman and other paranormal things. But Eugenia, he does this series of long interviews with her. And that's how I encountered her first, is through his work. And then I found out that she lived in Woodstock, like only about 11 miles from my house. And then I found out that she was on Facebook. And so she and I started corresponding and talking. And the reason why I think Eugenia is important and why I'm including her in the book is I first of all, she died very suddenly and unexpectedly. I guess it would have been, I'm trying to think, 6 years ago. And I mean, almost exactly 6 years ago. And she was what I think of as a paranormal pioneer. She had she was kind of an odd person, creative person to begin with, but she had a very striking UFO experience in Boston in the early 70s, and it completely changed her life. And she already had some paranormal experiences, like with ghosts and clairvoyant experiences, because that was part of her family. She grew up in a kind of an Irish Catholic sort of, or Scottish, excuse me, Catholic family. And but this changed her life, and she decided that because she was an artist, this was in New York City in the 70s, and she was all into the avant-garde art and theater crowd, that she decided that she would use her paranormal experiences as kind of an experiment to see what these things had to do with consciousness, and what these things had to do with creativity. Now, ironically, there was another person who lived in New York who was doing almost exactly the same thing. She was living in Elmira, New York, and her name was Jane Roberts. And she was channeling the Seth material. Oh, yeah. Now, somehow Eugenia connected with Jane, not just through her writing. They didn't connect personally, but just through her writing. And Eugenia, I think, was inspired in some ways, or encouraged that there was somebody like Jane Roberts doing this, because actually, if you read like a lot of the early stuff of Seth, he talks about UFOs, he talks about Bigfoot, he talks about all this stuff. A lot of people don't know that. They just think he's just kind of a new age dude, but he talks about all this stuff. So anyway, she decided that she would use her experiments, her experiences with UFOs, because she started having other experiences as sort of a experimenting with her life, like I said, to see what this had to do with creativity and consciousness and personal sort of expansion. And she found out some really interesting things, which she just details in her books, most of which are kind of memoirs and journals. But she also has a little bit of a paranoid streak, because one of the things she figured out, and this is probably because she also comes from a military family,
that'll do it.
And she had some weird experiences with that, where she became aware, probably because of her family background, that the military, the government, was interested in some of these things, from a consciousness controlling kind of point of perspective. And so she had a few experiences with that, which told her that she needed to be careful about how to expand her consciousness and how much to tell people. And so that's how she lived her life. And she had kind of a complicated life. She had a complicated set of relationships, first with her first husband, which didn't work, and then trying to raise a kid and being a weirdo like she was, trying to raise a kid. Her son wants nothing to do with this at all. I don't really blame him. Getting to know her, I kind of thought to myself, how would somebody like that raise a child? To be kind of strange. But anyway, so she became a fairly well-known avant-garde playwright who was produced and performed regularly in New York City. She was also a painter. She was also a poet, actually a very good poet, who was very prolific. And she wrote novels, and she did this work that she did. And was a very good psychic, apparently. When she couldn't make money any other way, she would do psychic readings, and was apparently very good at it. She was just really interesting. But she was a person whose life was defined by her experience with paranormal phenomena, and she sought to find some way of not even so much explaining it, but just trying to figure out like where it all connected with us, spiritually and creatively and things like that. And it was her approach is so different, because she saw whatever the paranormal is, she saw those things as being fundamentally connected with our reality as spiritual beings, as full beings, and that by just trying to make them physical, we're actually cutting off some of the most important aspects of what these things could be about for us, precisely because we can't control them. Mm-hmm. And so to me, I just want to introduce her to people, mostly because I don't want her legacy to die. What I will say is that, I mentioned in here that Jacques Vallée, who's a famous guy, mm-hmm. In one of his volumes of Forbidden Knowledge, one of his diaries or memoirs that he published, he talks about her and mentions that she was a person, whenever he came to New York City, he would check her out and they would have lunch, because he regarded her as probably being one of the most perceptive people about all of this stuff. So he was like, and she corresponded with like virtually every paranormal person, like everybody that was anybody, and so she was connected, and she just had her. I think that her approach is an approach that if we in the paranormal community want to get beyond our competitive, materialistic sort of way of looking at all of this, her approach is one possible way in which we can move into sort of a new phase, a new paradigm of looking at paranormal phenomena overall. So that's why I included her.
I like it.
And she was, besides that, she's completely interesting.
Yeah, I definitely want to look into her more after reading.
Her books are really hard to find, and so this is one of the problems. I mentioned this guy at the end of the chapter, Ben Roylance, mm-hmm. and he and I are trying to figure out ways of making sure that her stuff doesn't completely disappear, because her son does have, he does have her estate, and he's not doing anything with it, mm-hmm. and we don't know whether he wants us to republish her stuff or what. But it's like, so we're trying to figure all of that out.
That'd be amazing.
I mean, I have most of her paranormal books.
Oh, cool.
And he has a lot of her poetry. I have some of her poetry. He has all of her novels. We're looking right now for her plays, because a lot of her plays contain paranormal material in them. And apparently, when she would perform them, paranormal experiences would occur.
Wow.
and many of the young people who acted in her plays would have weird experiences. They'd go home and have weird experiences. So she had this ability to sort of generate this stuff,
Cool.
So, very cool. Fantastic. So we're trying to figure out how to preserve her, but one way is by talking about her.
Absolutely. Is there any online presence, or is it just a bit
very little? She herself was only sort of just beginning an online presence when she died, mm-hmm. and so there isn't a lot. You can Google her and come up with a few things, like and who knows, maybe some stuff will show up. But there are some like third-party sellers. Like if you look her up on Amazon, there are some third-party sellers where you can get some of her books of poetry and some of her writings. But it's really, really hard. In fact, I've gotten to the point where I'm about ready to just sort of like scan her stuff and just privately release PDFs free to people, because it's
Absolutely.
Like, you've got to read this. I keep saying, you've got to read Dark Frontiers. You've just got to read Dark Frontiers. And then probably her best book, let's see, I'm going to have to look her up actually in my book to actually give you the correct title of it. let's see here. Oh, Dr. Fu Manchu meets the Lonesome Cowboy, Sorcery and the UFO Experience. If you can find that book, I mean, I purchased my copy for $165.
Wow. Like on eBay or something?
Yeah, it was some used book service. That is probably the easiest book to begin with for her. There are some copies of her first book, Congratulations, the UFO Reality, which actually you should say it like this. Congratulations, the UFO reality, because that's exactly how she meant it. You know, it was kind of sarcastic, like, well, congratulations, you've had a UFO experience. Good for you, you know. But her books are full of this dry Yankee wit, and she's very ironic, and because she self-published, and because she had, as I describe in here, an ongoing series of issues with technology, which were not entirely just because of her, but because weird crap would happen with her typewriter, you know, and or with her word processors. That there are various weird typos and other strange things in her books, and she hated that because she was a writer and she hated it. But it was like that was also part of how those energies manifested, how the phenomena manifested, almost proving itself in her manuscripts. It's completely bizarre. I had never encountered that in anybody before. It's like her word processor would do the strangest things. She would contact me on Facebook and say, my word processor is doing this, and I would talk to one of my good friends who's like this IT maven, and they were like, I don't even know how that's possible. You know, how does a printer even do this? You know,
and you said that would even happen on her typewriter.
Exactly. But that was, so she got to the point where she would just like leave that stuff in because it was just kind of like proof of what she was talking about.
Exactly.
You know, so if you can, I can try to help you find some of her stuff. Sure, but me and Ben are working on trying to get her stuff located. Nice. And if her son will ever respond to our requests, hopefully eventually at some point be able to republish some of it.
That'd be magnificent.
Because that's what we'd really like to do.
Cool.
But anyway.
Well, can you tell the listeners where they can buy your book, first and foremost,
Sure.
and where they can find you online?
Yes, and just to give the title again, the title is Mysterious Beauty, Living with the Paranormal in the Hudson Valley. And the book is available pretty much anywhere. You can get an ebook version of it pretty much at any place where ebooks are available. The good thing about the ebook, not only because it's cheap, the photographs in the book are in color, that's the other good thing. If you do want a print copy, you can get a print copy at Amazon or at Barnes & Noble or at Baker and Taylor and Ingram. I think that they also do through their print on demand service. And my web presence, I'm working on a website myself. Hopefully it'll be done sometime in January or February. I'm not a web person, so I have to actually get somebody to help me with it. I've just started it. But you can, I do regularly appear on Church of Mavis Radio, which is a podcast that is run by Jeffrey Pritchett on Paranormal News Network, I believe. And then I also have a Facebook page. I have, although this is the name thing. It's to do the name thing.
Sure.
Okay. I'm known as Dr. WHAM, although the book is under my academic name, Dr. C.S. Matthews. Now, the WHAM has a long history, and you will hear me referred to as WHAM on Church of Mavis. The WHAM is an acronym for my Sufi name, which is Wahaba Hadia al-Mueed, which one of my friends here in Lawrence refused to pronounce and or write out. And she declared that I would be called WHAM. And so I have been WHAM ever since. And so I started going by that, not only on Church of Mavis, but where I live in the Hudson Valley. And so when I do talks at various places in the Hudson Valley, one of the places where I do a lot of talks is a place called the Enchanted Cafe in Red Hook, New York, upstate New York. There's also a Red Hook in Brooklyn. It's not that Red Hook. This is Red Hook in Dutchess County. And the guy who organizes those events for me started calling me Professor Wham. So that's where Professor Wham comes from. So you can find me on Facebook under Wahaba Hadia Al-Muweed, or I also administer a page called the Hudson Valley Paranormal Central.
Fantastic.
And so I post stuff there. And it's sort of just a clearinghouse for various things. Sometimes I try to focus on Hudson Valley events or Hudson Valley reports, but if there are other types of things that are of interest that that are relevant, then I'll post them as well. So everything gets posted there, from crop circles to cattle mutilations to UFOs to cryptids to everything.
Fantastic. I'll have all those links in the show notes too.
All right.
So.
And I will let you know as soon as that website is up, so that you can include that as well.
Yeah. Once I found out that you were going to have actual documentation and footage of some of the stuff that you talk about in the book, I check it regularly. Like, is it up yet?
It's good. It's probably going to be January or
Okay.
February, and that's just based on my own schedule.
Sure.
And my own ability to sit down and finally barf it out. But one of the things that I will include there, which I already have it. I could actually give you the link to it.
Sure.
Is a map of it's just a Google map. It's a personal Google map. But on that personal Google map, I have posted, tagged all the places and things that I talk about in the book.
Nice.
So that you can kind of see what the spread is, and I include not only all the paranormal events, but also a lot of the native ceremonial sites that I talk about.
Nice. Fantastic. Yeah.
So, because there are overlaps between those things.
Yeah, sure.
So.
For sure. Well, Professor Wham, thank you so much for
Thank you.
being on the show. I greatly appreciate it. The book is excellent. I highly recommend all of you listeners to go out and check it out. It's amazing. It's not only because the content inside of it is fascinating and just mind-blowing, but the way that it's written, it's very well articulated and amusing and just very well done from top to bottom. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks again, and
Thank you
write
for
another
having me.
one so we can have another conversation.
Once I get this one sort of settled,
Yes.
it was quite a process to do this. It took me
Sure.
like two full years. So
Well, it was well worth it.
thank you.
Yes. All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
That was a very enjoyable conversation. It was really, to reiterate, a very, very excellent book. Not only was the subject matter very compelling and just mind-blowing in and of itself, but the way that she took the pains to not only report this sort of stuff and present it to the public, but to do it in a way that was very eloquent and just very well written, very well articulated. I really enjoyed that. So it's an enjoyable book to read, even if you're not into that sort of stuff. But I found it fascinating, and it makes me want to go visit the Hudson Valley. I hope to do that sometime in the near future, and believe me, I will be doing some podcasting when I go up there too. But I can only do stuff like that if I start getting Patreon subscribers. And I am so, so glad to say, and I haven't heard back from this person to ask them whether or not I had the permission to say their name, but I've got my first Patreon subscriber, and it's very, very well appreciated. Thank you so much. And hopefully that will open the gates and others will join. It's very, it's painless.
I have no premium subscription. I'm not going to withhold part of the interview from you so that I can get you to pay a certain amount of money. There are things that aren't going to be on the public podcast that you will have access to, but it's more supplementary material or video versions of the interviews. But I ask for no set fee. You can do it for as low as $1 a month. You can do it for as high as you want, whatever you think that it's worth. But I would really not only, I mean, this is what I'm passionate about. I'm not passionate about painting houses or finishing drywall, which unfortunately is how I'm making my sustenance now. I would rather throw myself into this. This is something that I believe is very worthwhile. And I think these conversations are very much worth having, and I'd love to have more of them. The only reason I don't put out more podcasts is just because I simply don't have the time to do it. And that's because I have to do all these other things in my life, like, make a living, or try to at least. So any little bit that you could contribute would be such a big help. And also, if you can't contribute, if you would just share this, pass it around online, tell somebody that that you think that would appreciate it. Just spread the word. That would help greatly. Giving me good reviews in whatever podcast catcher you use to listen to this on or subscribe to it on, that helps a lot. Just leave some stars, whatever you think it's worth. Anything helps. Any energy that you can put into this is going to come back. So that would be very much appreciated. If you do want to be a Patreon subscriber, you can go to www.patreon.com/themeltpodcast. And there you will find my page and different ways that you can subscribe. I want to start a PayPal account for The Melt. So if you just want to do a one-time payment or not in the pay categories that I have there, you can do that too, but I haven't quite got that set up yet. So, and if this podcast started off by the desire to share people's firsthand experiences with this sort of stuff that falls outside of the spectrum of consensus reality. And I am still asking people for stories. I know that I don't have them on every episode, but hopefully someday that I will have enough where the subject matter of the episode and the story will sort of provide a theme for any given show. And you can send those. I mean, you can even, they don't have to be recorded in a studio or anything like that. Just record it on your phone and send it to themeltpodcast@gmail.com. And I'll figure out a way to convert it and to put it onto any episode if it has to do with the subject matter. Or perhaps you will create a subject matter that I'll want to do an interview to put with. Who knows? It's a collaboration. This is all a collaboration. And I hope to have on my website soon places where you can comment on the episodes and a forum where we can all talk together. Because I think hopefully if there's any sort of thing that I want to achieve with this show is the beginning of conversations and exchanges and building a community around these ideas and these possibilities and seeing what we can do. Reality is malleable. It's a co-collaborative matrix that we work in here. And our place in that collaboration is very, very important. And we are all interconnected. That is very easy to see if you go out into the world and project a part of you. You're going to get that part back. Even if you're not projecting it and you have it as a mind filter in how you're perceiving things, even though you may not even be physically interacting with them, you're going to get that stuff back. People are going to pick up on that in one way or another. So with that in mind, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I really did. I do hope she writes another book so I can have her on again. And maybe we'll just have her on just to talk about said subjects. It was very enjoyable. I'm going to a talk of hers tonight that's going to be near where I live. She is in town from New York. I'm in Lawrence, Kansas. And I'm going to shoot footage of that. And that will also be something that will be accessible by Patreon subscribers. So, all right. Thank you very much. Until next time, take care. And there's lots of good stuff in store, so please stay tuned.